Today, we're taking a look at AMD's latest 3D V-Cache enabled processor, the Ryzen 7 7700X 3D, a slightly downclocked version of the 7800X 3D at a more affordable $330 US price point, which is a nice 27% discount when comparing the MSRP pricing. But the 7800X 3D has been commonly found for less than $400 US, so where does that leave this new model? Okay, so while AMD might have released their first Zen 4 desktop CPUs 4 years ago now, and the 7800X 3D 3 years ago, you might think it's a bit odd that in 2026 we're getting a new Zen 4 based processor, but come on, you should be used to this by now, and I fully expect they'll be still releasing new binned variants in the year 2030, and I'm not even convinced we won't see another AM4 processor later this year. Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by ASUS and their new Neo motherboard lineup, including the Tough Gaming X870 Pro Wi-Fi 7 Neo, ROG Strix B850 Gaming Neo, and ROG Strix X870 EA Gaming Neo. Built for AMD's AM5 platform, the Neo range has been refreshed with upgraded power delivery to ensure maximum stability for the latest Ryzen processors. ASUS has also improved the building experience with their easy PC do-it-yourself features, including PCIe Q release, which allows you to remove your graphics card quickly without fighting with the retention clip. The Neo series also includes enhanced AI networking features, intelligent CPU cooling optimization, and redesigned memory pathways to improve signal quality, helping users to get more out of their high-speed DDR5 memory. So whether you're putting together a new system or upgrading your platform, learn more about the ASUS Neo motherboard range via the link in the video description. Anyway, the 7700X 3D is really just a downclocked version of the legendary Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. So the base clock has dropped from 4.2 GHz down to 4 GHz, and that's a 5% reduction. And then the boost clock has dropped from 5 GHz down to 4.5 GHz, and that's a larger 10% reduction. Other than that though, everything else remains the same. You still get 96 megabytes of L3 cache, a 120 watt TDP rating, and 8 cores with 16 threads. At this point, I think it's best to just go over the benchmark data, and then we'll discuss whether or not the 7700X 3D makes sense for $330 US, so let's get into it. Before we get into the blue bar graphs, here's a quick side-by-side comparison with the 7800X 3D running an all-core workload in Cinebench 2026. Under full load, the 7800X 3D clocked to 4.85 GHz, while the 7700X 3D clocked to 4.55 GHz, making the 7800X 3D 7% faster in this test, or at least it clocked 7% higher. Then, when looking at the maximum recorded frequency seen during the single-core test, the 7800X 3D clocked to 5.05 GHz, whereas the 7700X 3D reached 4.55 GHz, meaning the original model clocked 11% higher. Now, the 7% increase in core clocks for the all-core workload increased power usage by 7%, going from 85 watts to 91 watts. This also saw the peak core operating temperature increase from 75 degrees to 80 degrees. So, everything's behaving as advertised. The 7700X 3D is merely a downclocked 7800X 3D. Starting with Rainbow Six Siege, we see when using the medium quality settings that the 7700X 3D is 8% slower than the 7800X 3D, which actually made it slower than the 7600X 3D, delivering comparable performance to the 7500X 3D. Then when compared to the 270K Plus, it was 6% faster and 21% faster than the 250K Plus. Using the Ultra Plus preset increased the GPU bottleneck, and now the 7700X 3D is able to roughly match the 7600X 3D, coming in just 3% slower than the 7800X 3D, though it was 10% slower than the 9800X 3D, for those of you who are wondering. Using these higher visual quality settings, it remains 6% faster than the 270K Plus and 24% faster than the 250K Plus, while it also offered a 27% increase over the old 5800X 3D. Next up, let's dive into Marvel Rivals, tested using the built-in benchmark. At 1080p, with the medium preset, the 7700X 3D averaged 216 FPS with 1% lows of 165 FPS. This positions it right in the mix with Intel's latest lineup, sitting just ahead of the Core Ultra 5 250K Plus, while trailing the Core Ultra 7 270K Plus by a hair. It also fell roughly 10% behind the 7800X 3D when looking at the average frame rates, while maintaining a comfortable lead over the 6-core 7600X 3D and then thoroughly outpacing the aging 5800X 3D by over 20%. Then when we crank up the visual settings to 1080p with the Ultra Plus preset, the margins between these chips shrinks dramatically as the GPU takes on the heavier load, resulting in more GPU-bound results. The 7700X 3D, for example, delivered 149 FPS on average, with 116 FPS for the 1% lows, making it just 4% slower than the 7800X 3D. Next up, let's dive into Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered, again tested using the built-in benchmark. At 1080p with the medium settings, the Ryzen 7 7700X 3D puts up a strong showing, averaging 232 FPS with 1% lows of 150 FPS. And this lands it firmly in the upper echelon of our graph, sitting comfortably ahead of the 6-core 7600X 3D and outpacing Intel's 270K+. It also trailed the 7800X 3D by a minor 4% margin, while maintaining an impressive 19% lead over the older 5800X 3D. As you'd expect, cranking up the visual settings with the very high preset increased the GPU bottleneck, and this narrowed the performance gap. As a result, the 7700X 3D allowed for a very respectable 198 FPS on average, with a stable 121 FPS 1% low result, and that allowed it to remain within arm's reach of the 7800X 3D's 210 FPS, while extending its lead over the mid-range alternatives. In the heavily CPU-bound city districts of Baldur's Gate 3, like all 3D Vcache-enabled processors, the 7700X 3D thrives. With the medium settings, the processor delivered 197 FPS on average, allowing it to completely dominate the Intel options, beating the 270K+ by an incredible 35% margin. Then we're moving up to the Ultra preset data. The performance profile scales beautifully. The 7700X 3D keeps the experience exceptionally smooth with 163 FPS on average, offering essentially identical performance to the 7600X 3D, while sitting comfortably ahead of the 5800X 3D and then crushing the Arrow Lake chips yet again. Next up, let's dive into Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty. Here we tested in-game rather than using the built-in benchmark, and with the medium preset, the 7700X 3D puts up a really strong showing, averaging 203 FPS with 1% lows of 148 FPS, and this comfortably edged it past the 6-core 7600X 3D, though it was 7% slower than the 7800X 3D. It also cleared the Intel competition, putting a noticeable gap between itself and both the 270K+ and 250K+, while beating the older 5800X 3D by a 13% margin. When we switch gears by enabling the Ray Tracing Ultra preset, the massive graphical load shifts the focus once again to the GPU, causing the entire stack to compress dramatically. With this heavy GPU bottleneck in place, the 7700X 3D actually matched the real-world gaming performance of the flagship 9800X 3D, and keep in mind we are using an RTX 5090 at just 1080p, so you could apply this universally. And it means for those of you chasing maximum visual quality, the CPU can become a lot less important. Moving on to Battlefield 6, and we'll again start with the medium data. The 7700X 3D allowed for 181 FPS on average, putting it effectively on par with the 7600X 3D. Then with the Overkill preset enabled, we find similar results, though these slightly more GPU-limited test conditions did allow the 7700X 3D to close the gap to the 7800X 3D. It averaged 191 FPS, coming in just 4% slower than the 7800X 3D. In Space Marine 2, using the medium preset, the 7700X 3D hits a solid sweet spot, securing 121 FPS on average with 1% lows of 103 FPS. This allowed it to comfortably distance itself from the 270K+ while keeping a steady lead over the 6-core 7600X 3D. The 7800X 3D did pull away by a 10% margin, and this showcases the value of its higher core clock speeds in this CPU-bound scenario. Then when shifting to the Ultra Quality preset, the field compresses as the GPU starts to become the primary performance limiting component. Still, the 7700X 3D does well with 116 FPS on average, reducing its deficit against the 7800X 3D to a negligible margin. Next up, we have The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered. The medium preset data sees the 7700X 3D delivering a highly playable 180 FPS average, But what's interesting to note here is that Intel's Arrow Lake series takes a notable command in this title. The 250K Plus, for example, beat out the majority of the X3D stack. The 7700X3D performs virtually identical to the 7800X3D and 7600X3D here, demonstrating that cache scaling hits the wall early on. Stepping up to the very high preset reinforces this. The 7700X3D hit an average of 173 FPS, and that perfectly matched the 7600X3D while trailing the 7800X3D by just a single frame. Next, we have Spider-Man 2. Testing with the medium preset allowed the 7700X3D to stretch its legs, achieving a 217 FPS average, which placed it just behind the 7600X3D and slightly ahead of the 270K Plus. Then we have the ultimate ray tracing data, and here an interesting phenomenon occurs, where the Intel chips handle the engine's high overhead settings incredibly well, pushing the Core Ultra 7 270K Plus to the top of our chart with 109 FPS. Meanwhile, the 7700X3D delivered 89 FPS on average, placing it right in the middle of the X3D pack. Moving on to Mafia the Old Country, with the medium preset, the 7700X3D averaged 130 FPS. However, in this title, Intel's Arrow Lake architecture holds a slight performance edge, with the 250K Plus and 270K Plus carving out a minor lead over the 7700X3D, which ran practically neck and neck with the 7600X3D. However, it did still hold a massive 20% advantage over the 5800X3D. Then jumping up to the Epic preset introduces an intense GPU bottleneck where virtually all modern chips are flattened out. The 7700X3D hit 101 FPS on average, performing identically to that of the 270K Plus, while sitting just a frame behind the 7800X3D. Switching gears to the racing simulation ACC, we see the massive pool of 3D Vcache proves to almost be a cheat code for performance. Using the medium preset, the 7700X3D screams ahead with 264 FPS on average, allowing it to decimate Intel's flagship 270K Plus by a staggering 25% margin. But of course, it did trail its bigger brother, the 7800X3D, by just under a 10% margin. Then with the Epic preset, the story remains much the same. The 7700X3D delivered a superb 216 FPS on average, which allowed it to stay tightly clustered with the rest of the Zen 4 X3D chips while leaving the Intel lineup far behind in the rearview mirror. Now, Borderlands 4 serves as a textbook example of a heavily GPU-limited game. Even at 1080p, using an RTX 5090 with the medium preset, this graph is remarkably flat, with the 7700X3D averaging 158 FPS to match the 7600X3D, while sitting just 2 FPS behind the 7800X3D. This behavior solidifies entirely with the badass preset, resulting in almost entirely GPU-bound data. The 7700X3D delivered 102 FPS on average, matching the 9800X3D, 7800X3D, and 7600X3D frame for frame. Finally, we have Arc Raiders. Using the medium preset, the 7700X3D manages an average of 234 FPS, handing it a slight edge over the 270K Plus, while the 7800X3D manages a healthy 10% lead. Cranking the game up with the Epic preset naturally tightens the margins, but the 7700X3D did remain very strong, pushing 220 FPS on average, which again meant it was 10% slower than the 7800X3D, but faster than the 270K Plus. Okay, so across the 13 games tested, the 7700X3D was found to be 7% slower than the 7800X3D on average, making it 15% slower than the 9800X3D. In turn, that made it just 3% faster than the 7600X3D and 6% faster than the 270K Plus. Those margins did shrink with the more GPU-limited maximum quality settings, where it trailed the 7800X3D by just a 4% margin and beat the 270K Plus by a mere 3% margin. Now, taking the average data from the medium quality results, here's a look at the cost per frame data. So we're just factoring in the current retail price for each processor. Now, there are a few interesting takeaways here. Firstly, if you could just buy the CPU and be gaming, so you didn't require anything else, then the Core Ultra 5 250K Plus would be the part to get if you cared about value. It's almost 30% cheaper per frame than the 7700X3D while offering considerably stronger productivity performance. But here's how each CPU stacks up in terms of value when making a platform upgrade. For the AM5 and Arrow Lake processors, we're going with a $170 X870 or Z890 motherboard with 16GB of DDR5 memory for $230 US. The 5800X3D, on the other hand, can be paired with a $100 B550 board and 16GB of DDR4 for $130 US. Tallying all of those numbers up, the 7700X3D ends up costing 8% more than the 250K plus per frame, while matching the value of the 7500X3D and 270K plus. So when factoring in the price of a decent motherboard and just 16GB of DDR5 memory, the 7700X3D is a great value gaming CPU for $330 US, though that does depend on how cheap you can get the 7800X3D. We also see that the 5800X3D makes more sense once you factor in the cheaper AM4 motherboards, and as I said, a decent B550 board can still be had for $100, while 16GB of DDR4 costs just $130 US, and that takes the total package to $580, meaning that in terms of cost per frame, the 5800X3D ends up being better value than even the 250K plus. But my advice is, if you were to invest in one of these dead platforms, I'd recommend the 250K plus package over the 5800X3D, as you're not only getting better gaming performance, but you are getting considerably better productivity performance with newer features. Right, so as expected, the 7700X3D is around 4 to 7% slower than the 7800X3D, depending on the game and the test conditions, but given that it does clock 10% lower for core-heavy workloads, around a 7% reduction for gaming is a pretty safe bet. Now, as a result of the lower core clocks, power usage was slightly reduced, and because the same thermal interface material has been used, we saw a 5-degree reduction in peak operating temperatures. Given that, if the 7700X3D costs 10% less than the 7800X3D, then it's worth buying. At current typical retail prices, it will be around 20% cheaper, but we have seen the 7800X3D regularly down around $360 US, which would make the 7700X3D just 8% cheaper. So you will have to monitor pricing in your region to see if this new binned version is actually worth buying. For most of this year, the 7800X3D has been priced around $380 US. There have been some drops to $360 US at select retailers, and late last year, just before memory prices got stupid, it dropped as low as $320 US, which was an insane deal. So while the 7700X3D is a good option at $330 US in the current market, it's not super exciting given that we have had better deals within the last year. But the good news is AMD does often drop pricing pretty quickly. The 9070 GRE, for example, has already been spotted for $500 US, so I can't imagine it will be too long before we see the 7700X3D retailing for down around $300, possibly even lower. Of course, spoiling the potential party is DRAM pricing, and with no end in sight to that disaster, it is hard to get excited about anything right now, least of all CPUs based on a 3-year-old product. So that's the 7700X3D. Let me know what you think about it in the comment section below, and I'll be sure to read your comments and see what you think about this one. I'm not sure there'll be too many of you that'll be rushing out to buy this because, well, if you're already on AM5, you probably have a similar performing CPU for gaming, or it just wouldn't be worth the upgrade from maybe a 7600. But anyway, let me know in the comments, and as I said, I'll read those. In the meantime, you can also like the video, you can subscribe for more content, and we have the join button or Patreon. So signing up to either one of those will give you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, and Q&A stuff. So check that out if you're interested. If not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.